The year is 1347, and A of Messina, Sicily. The crew aboard Genoese trading ship limps into the port. This vessel carries more than just exotic goods from the distant shores of the Black Sea. They bring with them an invisible passenger, one that will forever alter the course of European civilization. As the ship's gangplank is lowered and the first sailor stumbles onto the dock, few could imagine that this moment marks the beginning of one of history's most devastating pandemics. Tonight, we'll uncover the story of how a microscopic bacterium brought an entire continent to its knees and reshaped the very foundations of medieval society. So just relax and let your mind drift as we explore the sleepy history of the Black Death. When we think of medieval Europe, we might picture grand cathedrals reaching toward the heavens, knights in shining armor, and bustling market squares filled with merchants hawking their wares. This was indeed a world of contrasts, where magnificent castles overlooked humble peasant villages, and where the church held sway over both kings and commoners alike. But beneath this romanticized vision lay a society built upon rigid hierarchies and delicate balances that would soon be tested beyond their limits. The Europe of the early 14th century was a continent experiencing both prosperity and strain. The population had been growing steadily for centuries, reaching levels that wouldn't be seen again until the 18th century. Towns and cities were expanding. Trade networks stretched across vast distances, and agricultural innovations had allowed more people to be fed than ever before. Yet this very success contained the seeds of vulnerability. The warming period that had blessed Europe with favorable growing conditions was beginning to wane. Harvests became less predictable, and famines struck with increasing frequency. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 had already demonstrated how quickly abundance could turn to scarcity. Millions perished during those 7 terrible years, weakening populations and making them more susceptible to disease. The social fabric that held communities together began to fray as desperate people competed for dwindling resources. Into this already fragile world came merchants and traders, connecting distant lands through an intricate web of commerce. The Silk Road linked Europe to Asia, while Mediterranean ports bustled with ships carrying goods from North Africa and the Middle East. This interconnected world of trade brought unprecedented wealth to some, but it also created pathways for something far more sinister to spread. The disease that would become known as the Black Death had its origins far from European shores. Deep in the steppes of Central Asia, among the scattered trading posts and nomadic tribes, a bacterium called Yersinia pestis had found the perfect hosts. Prairie dogs, marmots, and other rodents carried the infection, while fleas served as tiny vectors, spreading the disease from animal to animal. For centuries, this arrangement had persisted in relative isolation, causing occasional outbreaks among local populations, but remaining largely contained within its natural reservoir. The transformation of this regional affliction into a global catastrophe required a perfect storm of circumstances. Climate change played its part, as shifting weather patterns disrupted the delicate balance of ecosystems across Asia. Rodent populations migrated in search of food and favorable conditions, carrying their microscopic passengers into new territories. Military campaigns and the movement of armies created additional opportunities for the disease to spread, as soldiers and camp followers unknowingly transported infected fleas and rodents across vast distances. Perhaps most crucial of all was the expansion of trade routes that connected the furthest reaches of Asia to the bustling ports of Europe. Merchants traveling these routes didn't just carry silk, spices, and precious metals. Their ships and caravans provided ideal conditions for rats and fleas to thrive, creating mobile laboratories for disease transmission. The very prosperity that defined this era of global commerce would become the mechanism for its own destruction. The journey of the plague from its Asian origins to European shores was neither swift nor direct. Like ripples spreading across a pond, the disease moved along established trade routes, striking down communities in a seemingly random pattern. Constantinople, that great bridge between East and West, felt the plague's touch in 1347. From there, it was only a matter of time before European ports would receive their own deadly cargo. The Genoese merchants who arrived in Messina that autumn day in 1347 were likely unaware of the true nature of their affliction. They spoke of a mysterious illness that had struck their trading posts in the east, describing symptoms that seemed to defy medical understanding. Swollen lymph nodes, called buboes, gave the disease one of its many names. High fevers, delirium, and agonizing pain preceded death in most cases. Those few who witnessed the disease's progression described it in terms that seemed almost supernatural in their horror. The medical knowledge of the time was woefully inadequate to comprehend what was unfolding. Physicians trained in the ancient texts of Galen and Hippocrates found themselves confronting a disease that didn't conform to their understanding of how illness worked. The dominant theory of the four humours suggested that disease resulted from an imbalance of bodily fluids, leading to treatments that often made patients worse rather than better. Bloodletting, purging, and the application of various poultices were standard responses, but they proved utterly ineffective against this new menace. Religious explanations filled the void left by medical ignorance. Many believed the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins, a view that gained credence as the disease seemed to strike with biblical intensity. Priests and monks struggled to provide spiritual comfort while watching their own ranks decimated by the very disease they sought to explain. Churches, that had once been centres of community life, became repositories for the dead, as burial grounds overflowed and traditional funeral rites became impossible to maintain. The initial response to the plague's arrival varied dramatically from place to place. Some ports, having heard rumours of the disease's approach, attempted to turn away suspect ships. Venice, always quick to protect its commercial interests, established some of the first quarantine measures in European history. The word quarantine itself derives from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days, the period ships were required to wait before docking if they showed signs of illness among their crews. Yet such precautions were often too little, too late. The disease had already established multiple footholds across the Mediterranean, and its spread seemed to follow the very trade routes that had brought prosperity to the region. From Sicily, the plague leaped to mainland Italy, striking the great commercial cities of Genoa, Venice, and Florence with devastating effect. Each urban centre that fell became a new launching point for the disease's continued expansion. The speed of the plague's spread astonished contemporary observers. Within months of its arrival in Sicily, reports of similar outbreaks began filtering in from across southern Europe. Ships carrying the disease reached Marseille and other French ports along the Mediterranean coast. Overland trade routes carried the infection northward into the heart of France, while other vessels brought it to the ports of Barcelona and Valencia in Spain. What made the plague's advance so relentless was its ability to adapt to different modes of transmission. The disease could spread through flea bites, direct contact with infected individuals, and in some cases, through respiratory droplets when it took on its pneumonic form. This versatility meant that even communities that successfully isolated themselves from maritime trade could still fall victim to the disease through overland contact with infected populations. The social structure of medieval Europe, with its dense urban centres and frequent movement of people for trade, pilgrimage, and military service, provided ideal conditions for rapid disease transmission. Markets and fairs that had once been celebrations of prosperity became gathering points where the infection could jump from community to community. Monasteries and convents, despite their attempts at isolation, found themselves particularly vulnerable as they often served as hospitals and places of refuge for the sick. As the plague established itself across southern Europe, its effects began to ripple outward in ways that went far beyond simple mortality. Trade networks that had taken centuries to develop started to collapse as merchants abandoned their routes and cities closed their gates to outsiders. Agricultural production faltered as rural populations fled their fields or succumbed to the disease. The carefully balanced economy of medieval Europe, built upon centuries of gradual development, began to unravel with shocking speed. The psychological impact of the plague's arrival was perhaps as devastating as its physical toll. Communities that had never experienced anything comparable found themselves confronting their own mortality on an unprecedented scale. The certainties that had governed medieval life, from the protection offered by social hierarchies to the comfort provided by religious faith, suddenly seemed fragile and inadequate in the face of such overwhelming catastrophe. Contemporary chronicles from this period paint a picture of societies in shock, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what was unfolding. Writers described scenes that seemed to belong more to apocalyptic visions than to everyday reality. Streets filled with the dead, abandoned houses with doors standing open, and the constant sound of church bells tolling for the deceased created an atmosphere of surreal horror that would haunt the European imagination for centuries to come. Yet even in these darkest moments, human resilience began to manifest itself in unexpected ways. Communities that survived the initial onslaught started to adapt, developing new social structures and economic arrangements to replace those that had been destroyed. The very severity of the crisis forced innovations in governance, medicine, and social organization that would have lasting impacts long after the immediate threat had passed. As we prepare to delve deeper into this remarkable story, we must remember that the Black Death was not simply a medical catastrophe, but a transformative historical event that reshaped every aspect of European civilization. The disease that arrived in that Genoese ship would ultimately claim between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population, but its legacy extended far beyond mortality statistics. It would fundamentally alter social structures, economic systems, religious beliefs, and cultural practices in ways that continue to influence our world today. The transformation that began with the plague's arrival in Sicily would soon accelerate beyond anything Europe had ever experienced. As 1348 dawned, the disease had established itself as an unstoppable force, moving with a relentlessness that defied human understanding. The pathways carved by merchants and pilgrims became arteries of death, carrying the infection to every corner of the continent. France bore witness to some's most devastating effects. Paris of the plague, the jewel of medieval Europe and home to perhaps 200,000 souls, watched helplessly as its population withered. The great university that had attracted scholars from across Christendom saw its halls fall silent as masters and students alike succumbed to the disease. The Seine, which had carried commerce and prosperity to the city for centuries, now seemed to mock its inhabitants as reports arrived daily of new outbreaks along its banks. The French court, accustomed to the elaborate ceremonies and grand displays of royal power, found itself confronting an enemy that recognized no earthly authority. King Philip VI and his nobles retreated to their estates, hoping that distance from urban centres might provide protection. Yet the disease followed them even to their most remote castles, demonstrating that neither wealth nor noble blood offered immunity from its touch. In the countryside, the plague's impact was equally devastating, but manifested differently. Rural communities that had maintained the same patterns of life for generations watched their carefully ordered world collapse. Villages that had supported dozens of families for centuries were abandoned overnight, their fields left to return to wilderness. The delicate relationship between lord and peasant, which had formed the backbone of feudal society, began to crack under the strain of massive population loss. The church, which had provided both spiritual comfort and practical leadership to medieval society, found itself facing an unprecedented crisis. Monasteries that had preserved learning and culture for centuries saw their numbers decimated. The Abbey of St. Denis, repository of French royal history and symbol of religious authority, lost most of its monks within months of the plague's arrival. Similar scenes played out across the continent as religious communities that had weathered countless storms finally met their match. Parish priests, who formed the front lines of spiritual care, died in staggering numbers. Their commitment to administering last rites and providing comfort to the dying meant constant exposure to the disease. In some regions, entire ecclesiastical hierarchies simply vanished, leaving communities without the religious guidance that had shaped their lives for generations. The shortage of clergy became so severe that the church was forced to relax its standards, ordaining men with minimal training to fill the desperate need for spiritual leadership. England, protected by the English Channel from the initial Mediterranean outbreak, watched the plague's approach with growing dread. Reports from continental Europe painted an increasingly grim picture, but the island kingdom hoped its natural barriers might provide protection. These hopes were shattered in the summer of 1348, when ships from Calais brought the disease to the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. The plague's arrival in England followed patterns that were becoming grimly familiar across Europe. Coastal towns fell first, followed by inland communities as trade routes carried the infection deeper into the country. Bristol, one of England's most prosperous ports, saw its bustling harbours fall silent as merchants abandoned their trade and citizens fled to the countryside. The wool trade that had brought wealth to English merchants ground to a halt as entire communities involved in its production disappeared. London, already one of Europe's largest cities, experienced scenes of devastation that chroniclers struggled to describe adequately. The Thames, which had carried prosperity to the capital for centuries, became a highway of despair as bodies floated downstream from communities that could no longer bury their dead. Westminster Abbey, seat of English royal ceremony, lost many of its monks and saw its elaborate rituals reduced to hurried masses for the dying. The English countryside, with its scattered villages and manor houses, initially seemed to offer hope of escape from the urban catastrophe. Yet the plague proved equally adept at spreading through rural areas, moving along the networks of roads and pathways that connected market towns to their surrounding villages. The system of villenage that had bound peasants to their lords' lands began to break down as entire communities simply ceased to exist. Agricultural production, the foundation of medieval economy, suffered catastrophic disruption. Fields that had been carefully cultivated for generations lay fallow as their tenders succumbed to disease or fled in terror. The careful rotation of crops that had sustained European populations through centuries of growth came to an abrupt halt. Livestock wandered untended through abandoned villages, adding an element of surreal desolation to landscapes that had once buzzed with human activity. The plague's advance into Germany and the Holy Roman Empire revealed new dimensions of the crisis. The fragmented political structure of the empire meant that responses varied dramatically from region to region. Some cities managed to implement effective quarantine measures, while others fell victim to the very trade relationships that had brought them prosperity. The great commercial centres of the Hanseatic League watched their carefully constructed trading networks collapse as ports closed and merchants abandoned their routes. The disease's arrival in the Germanic lands also unleashed darker aspects of human nature that had been simmering beneath the surface of medieval society. Jewish communities, already marginalized and subject to periodic persecution, became scapegoats for the inexplicable catastrophe. Accusations of well poisoning and other forms of deliberate contamination spread faster than the plague itself, leading to massacres that added human cruelty to natural disaster. These pogroms represented one of the most shameful chapters in the plague's history, demonstrating how crisis could amplify existing prejudices and social tensions. Entire Jewish quarters were burned, their inhabitants murdered by mobs seeking someone to blame for their suffering. The irony was bitter indeed, as Jewish communities were dying from the plague at the same rates as their Christian neighbours, proving the absurdity of the accusations against them. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV found his authority challenged, not just by the plague's mortality, but by the social upheaval that followed in its wake. Traditional hierarchies that had maintained order for centuries crumbled as death made no distinction between noble and peasant, priest and layman. The elaborate feudal contracts that bound society together became meaningless when entire families and communities simply ceased to exist. In the Italian peninsula, where the plague had first made its European debut, the disease continued its relentless work throughout 1348 and beyond. Florence, that great centre of banking and culture, saw its population reduced from perhaps 100,000 to fewer than 50,000. The Medici banks, which had financed trade across Europe, watched their carefully constructed financial networks collapse as their agents died and their clients defaulted on loans they would never live to repay. Giovanni Boccaccio, who would later write the Decameron, witnessed firsthand the transformation of his beloved Florence. His descriptions of the city during the plague years paint a picture of social breakdown that seemed to reverse centuries of civilizational progress. Neighbors refused to help neighbors, families abandoned their sick relatives, and the basic bonds of human society appeared to dissolve under the pressure of omnipresent death. The artistic and intellectual flowering that had begun to characterize Italian cities ground to a halt as patrons died and workshops fell silent. The great cathedral projects that had symbolized urban prosperity and religious devotion stood half-finished as their builders succumbed to disease. Libraries and scriptoriums lost their copyists and scholars, threatening the preservation of knowledge that had been carefully maintained for generations. Venice, with its unique position as a bridge between East and West, experienced the plague's effects in particularly complex ways. The city's merchants, who had brought such wealth through their Eastern connections, now found those same relationships had introduced devastating disease. The Venetian response would become a model for future public health measures, but not before the city paid a terrible price in human lives. The Iberian Peninsula, connected to both European and North African trade networks, faced the plague from multiple directions. Barcelona and other Mediterranean ports received infected ships from Italy and southern France, while overland routes brought the disease across the Pyrenees. Spanish cities that had thrived on commerce with both Christian and Muslim lands watched their prosperity evaporate as international trade collapsed. The Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian reconquest of Muslim Spain, had created a complex society where different religious communities coexisted uneasily. The plague struck all communities equally, but its aftermath would see increased tensions as surviving populations competed for diminished resources. The delicate balance that had allowed for cultural exchange and economic cooperation began to shift toward greater hostility and suspicion. As the plague established itself across Western Europe, its effects began to ripple outward in ways that would transform the continent's relationship with the wider world. Trade routes that had connected Europe to Asia and Africa contracted dramatically, reducing the flow of exotic goods that had become integral to European life. Spices, silks, and precious metals that had once flowed freely along established pathways became rare commodities as merchant networks collapsed. The demographic catastrophe unfolding across Europe would ultimately create opportunities as well as challenges. Labour shortages that seemed like disasters in the immediate aftermath of the plague would eventually empower surviving workers to demand better conditions and higher wages. The rigid social hierarchies that had defined medieval life would be forced to adapt to new realities created by massive population loss. Religious institutions, despite their losses, would be compelled to reform and adapt in ways that might not have occurred without the crisis. The shortage of clergy would lead to increased lay participation in religious life, while questions about divine justice raised by the plague's indiscriminate destruction would fuel theological debates that would reshape European Christianity. The scientific and medical advances that would eventually emerge from attempts to understand and combat the disease lay still in the future, but the foundations for those developments were being laid as traditional explanations proved inadequate to the crisis at hand. The very magnitude of the catastrophe would eventually force European society to develop new ways of thinking about disease, public health, and social organization. As the plague tightened its grip on Western Europe, the ripple effects began to manifest in ways that would fundamentally alter the continent's economic foundations. The monetary systems that had evolved over centuries to support long-distance trade found themselves under unprecedented strain. Silver mines in Central Europe saw their production plummet as workers fled or perished, creating shortages of the precious metal that served as the backbone of international commerce. The banking houses of Lombardy and Tuscany, which had developed sophisticated methods of credit and exchange, watched their carefully constructed networks crumble as debts became uncollectible and partners vanished without trace. The great fairs that had served as meeting points for merchants from across Europe fell silent one by one. The Champagne fairs, which had been the beating heart of medieval commerce for over 2 centuries, ceased to function as the plague swept through the region. These gatherings had been more than mere markets. They were places where different cultures met, where ideas were exchanged alongside goods, and where the complex web of European trade relationships was maintained and renewed. Their disappearance marked the end of an era in commercial history. In the wake of this economic collapse, entirely new patterns of production and distribution began to emerge. Local communities that had once relied on imported goods were forced to become self-sufficient, leading to a renaissance in small-scale manufacturing and craft production. Villages that had specialized in single crops for export to distant markets now had to diversify their agriculture to feed their own populations. This shift toward localization would have lasting effects on European economic development, creating more resilient but less interconnected regional economies. The plague's advance into Eastern Europe revealed yet another dimension of the crisis. The vast expanses of Poland and Hungary, with their scattered settlements and different social structures, initially seemed to offer hope that the disease might be contained. However, the same trade routes that had brought prosperity to cities like Krakow and Budapest also served as pathways for the infection. The Kingdom of Poland, which had been experiencing a period of expansion and cultural flowering under King Casimir III, found its ambitious building projects abandoned as craftsmen and labourers succumbed to the disease. The unique social structure of Eastern Europe, with its mix of settled populations and nomadic groups, created different patterns of disease transmission. The plague spread more slowly through the sparsely populated countryside, but struck with devastating effect when it reached the growing urban centres. Vilnius, Riga, and other Baltic cities watched their populations dwindle as the disease moved northward along the amber trading routes that had connected northern Europe to the Mediterranean for millennia. The Teutonic Knights, that powerful military order that had dominated the Baltic region for generations, found their carefully organized state facing an enemy they could not defeat through conquest. Their fortress cities, designed to withstand siege warfare, proved powerless against an invisible invader that recognized no walls or fortifications. The elaborate feudal hierarchy they had imposed on their territories began to break down as death claimed lords and subjects with equal ruthlessness. Norway and Sweden, at the northern edge of European civilization, received the plague through their maritime connections to the continent. Bergen, the great trading port that served as a link between Norway and the Hanseatic League, saw its bustling harbours fall silent as the disease arrived with German merchants in 1349. The mountainous terrain and scattered settlements of Scandinavia created a different pattern of infection, with some remote valleys remaining untouched while others were completely depopulated. The impact on Scandinavian society was particularly profound because of the region's relatively small population and harsh climate. Communities that had barely sustained themselves through careful cooperation and resource sharing found their survival strategies useless against the plague's onslaught. Ancient traditions of mutual aid and collective decision-making, which had evolved over centuries to help small populations survive in challenging environments, proved inadequate to the scale of the crisis. Iceland, connected to the wider world only through seasonal shipping, experienced one of the most concentrated outbreaks in European history. When plague-infected ships arrived at Reykjavik in 1402, they brought devastation to a population that had no previous exposure to the disease. The island's isolation which had once protected it from continental conflicts and diseases, now became a trap that prevented any escape from the infection. The transformation of rural life across Europe during this period was perhaps even more dramatic than the urban catastrophe that captured most contemporary attention. The manorial system, which had organized agricultural production for centuries, simply ceased to function in many regions. Lords who had once commanded hundreds of peasants found themselves ruling over empty fields and abandoned villages. The elaborate networks of obligation and service that had bound rural society together dissolved as the human relationships that sustained them disappeared. In England, entire counties saw their populations reduced by more than half. Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and other agricultural heartlands were transformed from productive farmland into virtual wilderness. Wolves, which had been driven from most of England during the medieval population expansion, began to return to areas where human presence had vanished entirely. The landscape itself seemed to be reclaiming territory that had been wrested from it through centuries of human effort. The collapse of agricultural production created cascading effects throughout European society. Mills that had ground grain for generations stood idle as there was no grain to process. The complex networks of obligation that had required peasants to use their lord's mill, pay taxes in kind, and provide labour services became meaningless when there were no peasants to fulfil these duties. The feudal contracts that had structured rural life for centuries were rendered null and void by the simple fact that one or both parties to these agreements no longer existed. In France, the demographic catastrophe was compounded by ongoing military conflicts with England. The 100 Years' War, which had already disrupted normal life across much of the kingdom, became even more destructive as plague-weakened populations found themselves unable to resist foreign invasion or maintain basic defences. Armies that had once numbered in the tens of thousands could barely muster a few hundred men, forcing military commanders to completely rethink their strategies and objectives. The great castles that had dominated the French countryside for centuries found themselves without adequate garrisons to maintain their defences. Many of these fortifications, which had taken decades to build and had withstood numerous sieges, were simply abandoned as their noble owners died and their retainers scattered. The symbols of feudal power that had defined the medieval landscape began to crumble from neglect rather than conquest. Portuguese and Spanish coastal cities, which had been developing increasingly sophisticated maritime technologies and exploring new trade routes, saw their expansion halted as the plague struck their populations. The early voyages of discovery that would eventually lead to global European expansion were postponed as the human resources needed for such ambitious undertakings were decimated by disease. Ships that had been built for exploration sat rotting in harbours where there were no longer enough sailors to crew them. The intellectual life of Europe suffered losses that would take centuries to recover. Universities that had been centres of learning and debate saw their faculties decimated and their student bodies scattered. The University of Paris lost more than half its masters, while Oxford and Cambridge watched their colleges empty as scholars fled or died. The careful preservation of knowledge that had been the life's work of countless scribes and teachers was interrupted as libraries fell silent and scriptoriums closed their doors. The production of manuscripts, which had been the primary means of preserving and transmitting knowledge, virtually ceased in many regions. The complex network of monastic houses and cathedral schools that had maintained literacy and learning through the Dark Ages found themselves facing their greatest challenge since the fall of Rome. Texts that had been copied and recopied for generations were lost forever as the institutions that housed them disappeared. Yet even in this darkest period, human ingenuity began to assert itself in remarkable ways. Communities that survived the initial onslaught started developing new forms of social organization adapted to their reduced circumstances. Traditional hierarchies based on birth and inherited status gave way to more practical arrangements based on skill and ability. The survivors who emerged from the plague years would be forced to rebuild their world from the ground up, creating opportunities for innovation and change that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The demographic transformation was so complete in some regions that entire languages and dialects began to disappear. Small communities that had maintained distinct cultural traditions for centuries found themselves reduced to a handful of survivors who gradually assimilated into larger groups. The linguistic diversity that had characterized medieval Europe was simplified as local variations died out along with their speakers. Religious life underwent equally profound changes as traditional structures proved inadequate to the crisis. The elaborate hierarchies of the church, built up over centuries of careful organization, found themselves decimated at every level. Bishops died alongside their congregations. Abbots perished with their monks, and parish priests succumbed while ministering to their flocks. The careful theological debates that had occupied scholars for generations seemed suddenly irrelevant in the face of such overwhelming mortality. Popular religious movements began to emerge as people sought new forms of spiritual expression that could address their unprecedented circumstances. Flagellant processions moved across the countryside, seeking to appease divine wrath through public penance and self-punishment. These movements often operated outside traditional church authority, creating new forms of religious practice that challenged established doctrine and hierarchy. The cult of saints associated with plague protection grew dramatically as people sought supernatural intervention against the disease. Saint Roche, who was said to have cured plague victims through his prayers, became one of the most popular religious figures of the period. Churches dedicated to plague saints sprang up across Europe, often built by survivors seeking to commemorate their deliverance from the disease. As the plague continued its relentless advance through Europe, it became clear that this was not simply another epidemic that would run its course and disappear. The scale of the catastrophe was transforming European civilization in ways that would be felt for centuries to come. The world that emerged from the plague years would be fundamentally different from the one that had existed before 1347, shaped by loss, adaptation, and the hard-won wisdom of survivors who had witnessed the collapse of everything they had once thought permanent and secure. The story of Europe's transformation was far from over, but already the outlines of a new world were beginning to emerge from the ruins of the old. The changes set in motion by the Black Death would continue to reverberate through European society, creating the conditions for developments that would reshape not only the continent, but eventually the entire world. The psychological trauma inflicted by the Black Death extended far beyond the immediate horror of mass mortality. Survivors found themselves inhabiting a world that seemed fundamentally altered, where the basic assumptions that had governed daily life for generations no longer held meaning. The concept of future planning, which had driven everything from agricultural cycles to dynastic marriages, became almost incomprehensible when death could strike without warning or reason. Families that had carefully preserved their lineages through centuries of strategic alliances watched their bloodlines simply end, leaving elaborate genealogies as monuments to vanished hopes. The art and literature produced during and immediately after the plague years reflected this profound shift in human consciousness. Where medieval artistic expression had once focused on themes of divine glory and earthly hierarchy, plague-era works became obsessed with mortality and the fragility of human existence. The Dance of Death, or Danse Macabre, emerged as a dominant artistic motif, depicting skeletons leading representatives of every social class in a final, equalizing dance. These images appeared on church walls, in illuminated manuscripts, and carved into cemetery monuments, serving as constant reminders that death recognized no earthly distinctions. The transformation of European architecture during this period reflected the changing relationship between the living and the dead. Churches that had once celebrated divine majesty through soaring heights and elaborate decoration now incorporated practical considerations for mass burial and memorial. Charnel houses, where the bones of plague victims were carefully arranged in decorative patterns, became common features of European cemeteries. These structures served both practical and spiritual purposes, providing space for new burials while creating contemplative spaces where survivors could meditate on mortality. Urban planning began to incorporate lessons learned from the plague's devastating passage through crowded city centres. Venice, which had suffered enormously despite its maritime wealth and sophisticated government, became a pioneer in public health measures that would influence city planning across Europe. The concept of quarantine, initially developed for ships, was extended to entire neighbourhoods and buildings. Plague hospitals, or lazarettos, were constructed on isolated islands where the sick could be cared for without endangering the broader population. The economic disruptions caused by the plague created opportunities for technological innovation that might not have emerged under normal circumstances. Labour shortages forced surviving artisans and farmers to develop more efficient methods of production. Watermills and windmills, which had been luxury installations in prosperous times, became necessities when human labour was scarce. The development of mechanical clocks accelerated as communities needed precise timekeeping to coordinate the reduced workforce available for essential tasks. Agricultural innovation took on new urgency as survivors struggled to maintain food production with drastically reduced populations. Three-field crop rotation systems, which had sustained European agriculture for centuries, were abandoned in favour of more intensive methods that could produce adequate yields with fewer workers. The cultivation of new crops, particularly legumes that could enrich soil while providing protein-rich food, became widespread as communities sought to maximise the productivity of their limited human resources. The guild system that had organised urban crafts and commerce for generations found itself forced to adapt to radically changed circumstances. Guilds that had once jealously guarded their trade secrets and restricted membership to maintain high prices were compelled to accept new members and share knowledge more freely. The elaborate apprenticeship systems that had taken years to complete were shortened out of necessity, leading to changes in skill transmission that would persist long after population levels recovered. Women found their social and economic positions dramatically altered by the demographic catastrophe. In many regions, the death toll among men was particularly severe, leaving women to assume responsibilities that had traditionally been forbidden to them. Widows who inherited their husbands' businesses often continued operating them successfully, challenging assumptions about gender roles that had seemed immutable. The shortage of clergy led to increased lay participation in religious life, with women taking on roles in parish administration and religious instruction that had previously been reserved for ordained men. The legal systems of Europe underwent fundamental changes as traditional courts and administrative structures collapsed along with their personnel. Legal codes that had developed over centuries to govern complex social relationships became irrelevant when entire categories of people simply ceased to exist. Property law faced particular challenges as inheritance patterns that assumed multiple heirs and complex family structures had to be adapted to situations where single survivors inherited vast holdings with no clear precedent for their management. Marriage customs and family structures evolved rapidly in response to the changed demographic landscape. The elaborate courtship rituals and dowry negotiations that had characterized noble marriages became simplified out of necessity. Age differences between spouses increased as the shortage of marriage-age partners forced people to consider matches that would have been socially unacceptable in earlier generations. The extended family networks that had provided social support and economic cooperation were replaced by smaller, more flexible arrangements that could adapt to uncertain circumstances. The monetary systems of Europe faced unprecedented challenges as traditional relationships between supply and demand were completely disrupted. Silver mining, which had provided the currency that lubricated medieval commerce, experienced dramatic fluctuations as mining communities were abandoned and then slowly repopulated. The value of money itself became unstable as goods that had once been readily available became scarce luxuries, while other commodities lost their markets entirely as their consumers disappeared. International diplomacy was transformed as the plague eliminated many of the political figures who had shaped European relationships for decades. Treaties and alliances that had been carefully negotiated became meaningless when the rulers who had signed them died without clear successors. The complex web of feudal obligations that had structured international relations was simplified by necessity, leading to more direct and practical arrangements between surviving powers. The spread of the plague into Eastern Europe revealed the limitations of traditional political structures in dealing with unprecedented crises. The Holy Roman Empire, already a complex and often dysfunctional political entity, found its authority further weakened as local communities were forced to develop their own survival strategies without imperial guidance. The elaborate ceremonial aspects of imperial rule became impossible to maintain when the personnel needed to stage such events had perished or fled. The impact on Islamic communities in Spain and other parts of Europe demonstrated that the plague recognized no religious boundaries. Muslim physicians, who had preserved much classical medical knowledge through the early medieval period, found their treatments as ineffective as those of their Christian counterparts. The scholarly exchanges between Islamic and Christian communities that had enriched European intellectual life were disrupted as centers of learning in both traditions struggled to maintain basic operations. The Jewish communities that survived the pogroms unleashed by plague panic found themselves in a paradoxical position. While they had suffered terrible persecution during the height of the crisis, the demographic changes that followed sometimes created new opportunities for economic participation. In regions where traditional Christian merchant families had been eliminated by plague or violence, surviving Jewish traders could fill commercial roles that had previously been closed to them, though always under precarious circumstances. The transformation of European Christianity during this period went far beyond institutional changes to encompass fundamental shifts in theological understanding. The concept of divine justice, which had provided comfort and explanation for previous hardships, was severely challenged by the apparent randomness of plague mortality. Theologians struggled to reconcile traditional teachings about divine providence with the observable fact that the disease struck pious and impious alike with equal severity. Popular religious practices evolved to incorporate new understandings of divine intervention and human agency. The rise of mysticism and personal religious experience reflected a turn away from institutional Christianity toward more direct spiritual relationships. Lay religious movements gained strength as traditional clerical authority was weakened by massive mortality among the priesthood. These developments would have lasting effects on European religious life, creating precedents for later reform movements. The preservation of knowledge faced its greatest challenge since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Monastic libraries that had safeguarded classical texts through centuries of political upheaval found themselves without the scribes and scholars needed to maintain their collections. The careful copying work that had preserved ancient learning was interrupted, leading to the permanent loss of texts that had survived everything from Viking raids to political revolutions. The development of new forms of record-keeping emerged as survivors attempted to document the catastrophe they had witnessed and preserve information for future generations. Chronicle writing took on new urgency as people recognized that entire ways of life were disappearing. These accounts, often written by survivors with limited literary training, provide invaluable insights into how ordinary people experienced and understood the transformation of their world. The plague's advance into Scandinavia revealed unique patterns of adaptation that would influence Northern European development for centuries. The harsh climate and scattered population of the Nordic countries created different survival strategies than those employed in more densely populated regions. Communities that had relied on seasonal migration and resource sharing were forced to develop more sedentary approaches to survival as traditional movement patterns became impossible to maintain. The impact on maritime communities was particularly severe, as the shipping that had connected distant regions became a primary vector for disease transmission. Fishing villages that had sustained themselves through seasonal expeditions found their populations too depleted to man their boats. The complex networks of seasonal labor that had supported activities like herring fishing in the North Sea collapsed as the mobile workforce that made such enterprises possible simply disappeared. The cultural exchanges that had enriched European civilization through contact with distant regions were severely disrupted as travel became associated with mortal danger. Pilgrimages to holy sites, which had been major features of medieval religious life, virtually ceased as communities closed themselves off from outside contact. The international scholarly networks that had connected universities across Europe were broken as masters, and students abandoned their studies to flee from infected areas. As the plague continued its relentless advance across the continent, it became increasingly clear that Europe was experiencing not merely a demographic crisis, but a fundamental transformation that would reshape every aspect of civilization. The world that would emerge from this catastrophe would be built upon new foundations, created by survivors who had witnessed the collapse of everything their ancestors had built, and who were now tasked with imagining entirely new ways of organizing human society. The changes already set in motion by the plague's passage would continue to reverberate through European development for generations to come. The crisis that had begun with the arrival of a single infected ship had grown into a continental transformation that would ultimately reshape not only Europe, but the entire trajectory of human civilization. The transformation of educational institutions across Europe represented one of the most profound and lasting changes wrought by the plague years. Universities that had taken centuries to establish their reputations and build their scholarly communities found themselves facing an existential crisis that went far beyond simple mortality statistics. The University of Bologna, which had pioneered the study of law and attracted students from across the known world, watched its enrollment plummet from thousands to mere dozens as both teachers and pupils succumbed to the disease or fled in terror. The elaborate system of scholarly debate and knowledge transmission that had defined medieval learning was disrupted in ways that would reshape European intellectual life for generations. The careful mentorship relationships between masters and students, which had preserved and advanced learning through personal instruction and guided study, were severed by death or abandonment. Young scholars who might have spent years absorbing the wisdom of their teachers instead found themselves thrust into positions of authority with incomplete training and limited resources. The physical infrastructure of learning suffered equally devastating losses. Libraries that had been assembled through centuries of careful acquisition and copying saw their collections scattered as monasteries and schools closed their doors. Manuscripts that represented the life's work of countless scribes were abandoned to decay in empty buildings, their parchment providing nesting material for rats and birds rather than wisdom for future generations. The great scriptoriums that had maintained the flow of knowledge through the early medieval period fell silent as their occupants either died or fled to seek safety in isolation. The linguistic diversity that had characterized European scholarship was simplified as smaller centers of learning disappeared entirely. Regional dialects and scholarly traditions that had flourished in local schools and monasteries vanished along with their practitioners. The complex web of intellectual exchange that had connected distant regions through traveling scholars and circulating manuscripts was broken as movement became synonymous with mortal danger. Ideas that might have spread across the continent in a matter of months now remained isolated in their places of origin. The practice of medicine, already primitive by modern standards, faced a crisis of confidence that would fundamentally alter its development. Physicians who had trained for years in the theories of ancient authorities found their knowledge utterly inadequate to the crisis at hand. The careful balance of humours that was supposed to maintain health proved meaningless against a disease that struck with such virulence and apparent randomness. Bloodletting, purging, and other traditional treatments not only failed to help, but often hastened the death of those they were meant to cure. Medical schools across Europe watched their faculties decimated as physicians died alongside their patients. The University of Montpellier, renowned throughout the medieval world for its medical training, saw its enrollment collapse as prospective students questioned the value of studying a discipline that seemed powerless against the greatest health crisis of their age. Those physicians who survived often abandoned their profession entirely, their confidence shattered by the failure of everything they had been taught to believe. The development of new approaches to understanding disease began to emerge from this crisis of traditional medical authority. Physicians who had witnessed the plague's progression started to question fundamental assumptions about how illness spread and what factors influenced its severity. The careful observation of symptoms and disease patterns that would eventually lead to more scientific approaches to medicine had their origins in the desperate attempts of plague-era doctors to understand what they were confronting. The transformation of artistic expression during this period reflected not only the immediate trauma of mass mortality, but also profound changes in how Europeans understood their place in the world. The confident assertion of human achievement that had characterized much medieval art gave way to a more somber recognition of human fragility. Church decorations that had once celebrated divine glory and earthly success were replaced by stark reminders of mortality and the vanity of worldly ambition. Sculptors and painters who survived the plague years found themselves working for patrons whose priorities had been fundamentally altered by their experiences. Commissions that might once have celebrated military victories or political achievements now focused on themes of death, judgment, and spiritual preparation. The elaborate tomb monuments that became popular during this period reflected not vanity, but a desperate desire to be remembered in a world where entire families and communities could disappear without trace. The production of illuminated manuscripts, which had reached extraordinary levels of sophistication in the decades before the plague, was severely disrupted as both artists and patrons disappeared. The complex workshops that had supported manuscript production required teams of specialized craftsmen working in careful coordination. When key members of these teams died, the entire enterprise often collapsed, leading to the loss of artistic techniques and traditions that had taken generations to develop. Musical traditions faced similar disruptions as the institutions that had supported them crumbled. Cathedral choirs that had maintained elaborate liturgical traditions for centuries found themselves without the trained voices needed to perform complex polyphonic works. Monastic communities that had preserved ancient chants saw their musical libraries scattered as their members died or fled. The oral traditions that had passed musical knowledge from teacher to student were broken, leading to the permanent loss of repertoires that had enriched European cultural life for generations. The craft guilds that had organized urban production and maintained quality standards found their carefully developed systems overwhelmed by the scale of disruption. Guilds that had once restricted membership to maintain high prices and preserve trade secrets were forced to accept anyone with basic skills simply to continue functioning. The elaborate apprenticeship programs that had taken years to complete were compressed or abandoned entirely as master craftsmen died before they could fully train their successors. The Black Death stands as perhaps the most profound transformation in European history, a catastrophe that reshaped every aspect of civilization in ways that continue to influence our world today. From the moment that Genoese ship arrived in Messina, carrying its invisible passenger from the distant shores of Asia, Europe embarked on a journey through darkness that would ultimately lead to rebirth. The medieval world of rigid hierarchies and unchanging traditions was swept away, replaced by a more dynamic society where merit could triumph over birth, where new ideas could flourish in the absence of old authorities, and where human ingenuity was forced to find solutions to unprecedented challenges. The survivors who emerged from those terrible years carried within them the seeds of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the modern world itself, proving that even from history's greatest catastrophes can come humanity's most remarkable achievements.